Our speaker today is Tim Moloney, and the topic is Plan to Simplify, Plant to Enjoy. And Tim has spent the last 18 years working as lead landscape designer and landscape sales manager for Rost Incorporated in Columbia, Missouri. He began teaching at MU in 2008, became full-time faculty member in the horticulture and ornamental design department in 2014. He instructs master gardeners in the use of perennials through MU Extension. During that time, he thoroughly researched the ins and outs of perennials through MU Extension. During that, with his landscape design build business, and diligently worked at learning what to do and, more importantly, what not to do to help ensure a successful career in the landscape industry. His hope is that he can pass along all that he has learned through the School of Hard Knocks and practical experience to the next generation of landscape designers. Take it away, Tim.
All right, thank you very much, Lynn. Yeah, it's I've often made the comment that my education at the University of Missouri allowed me to walk into the offices of Ross Landscaping and say I can be your designer, but it's really the time I spent as a designer with Ross that enables me to come back to the university and instruct students today. And really, we use the term School of Hard Knocks. It's really just a matter of managing the mistakes and hoping you don't make the same ones over and over again. And, in this topic, this plan to simplify and plant to enjoy kind of was born out of a realization that, with aging parents and a lot of my clients aging as well, we have a tendency to get ourselves into trouble as gardeners, trouble that we don't necessarily foresee in our immediate future, but as we age and our abilities to garden, not our desire, but our abilities to garden actually fall off a bit. This is just kind of a way to keep future maintenance needs in mind when we are planning and planting our gardens now. So with that in mind, keep in mind some of this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's a little bit of a timeline, the life of a gardener as I've seen it kind of develop. First of all, we're born, right? The gardener is born. And then maybe if you're like me when you're younger, we have the opportunity to help parents or grandparents in the garden. I say opportunity, maybe we enjoyed it, maybe we did not, maybe it was a chore. But for me anyway, I had the opportunity to work with people, my elders, I should say, that were really into gardening and kind of got that initial spark going for a desire to create an environment outside around our homes that was pleasant to be in. And then, in my teens and 20s, I really had no either garden interest or time so much. We had other things that took our priorities away from us, whether it be school or activities associated with school or just life in general. We didn't have a lot of room for gardening at that point. And then as we transition into our 30s, maybe we now have our own place, right? We buy our own property. We have the opportunity to do something with that. We start a family. I got a little nostalgic for gardening. I worked some in my own yard and garden and grew my own food for a little while and had a blast with it, fought the deer, right? Figured out what the deer would and wouldn't bother and went that route. And then from there, I went to the 40s and all of a sudden my kids got active. We had mortgages and bills and college funds and a job, and really even as a landscape designer, my priority for personal landscape fell to the bottom a little bit. That saying, the cobbler's children are barefoot, that kind of applied to my personal garden and landscape for quite some time. And then as what I'm noticing now, as I'm moving into my 50s, kids are starting to leave home or be less active or more self-sufficient even maybe. There's a little bit more time, maybe some less bills, and then we can start picking up gardening again. And I like this, really going to, this quote, I'm really going to make this space sweet when I retire. So you're starting to look forward to retirement and what you can do with your garden and your property as you get more time. And then we move into our 60s and we can retire, right? Hopefully we can retire. And now maybe we're into that, we're a full-time gardener and we create our own paradise. But then there's these little things, right, that are telling you maybe slow down a little bit. My knees, hips, starting to hurt a little bit more. I get winded easily, but the place looks great. It's something that I'm proud of. I bring all my master gardener friends over to take a look, and we host parties, and everybody just loves our garden. And this is that part. This is your golden age of gardening right here. And then we move into our 70s, and now maybe we're having a knee or a hip, maybe a heart valve replaced, and can't quite get out there as much as I used to. Maybe I should hire someone. And I'll tell you, a lot of the clients that I had as a designer were in this stage to where they decided to hire somebody to help corral the work that they have created for themselves. And then from there, we move on into the 80s, hopefully, right? The place is starting to look a little rough. Maybe we can't afford to pay for the help anymore. My kids and grandkids would love to help, but I hate to ask, they're just so busy, right? And then death. And it's no longer my problem. And that seems a little dark, but the fact of the matter is at some point we're going to be done with that yard and garden. And what I would try to do with this discussion today and designing as we go forward is to have realistic expectations of what we will be able to do, so that instead of working and worrying beyond our ability to do so, we can actually enjoy it more, enjoy our garden and enjoy our space a little bit longer into our own personal timeline as a gardener. So basically we're going to be talking about, maintenance and how to avoid, quote unquote, biting off, more than you can chew. And that, when we're designing, we want to try to keep the future maintenance requirements in mind when planning our gardens. A lot of us, when we are fit, when we are healthy, when we are still, quote unquote, strong, we have a tendency to worry less about what we're doing to ourselves while we still love and enjoy doing it. But the fact of the matter is that we're not necessarily going to be able to do so as long as we would hope. Okay, maintenance is actually crucial. It's actually crucial to the longevity of any landscape. Landscapes are meant to be both, basically be aesthetically functional. They're supposed to add curb appeal and value to our homes. They're supposed to add space for us to enjoy time outside. And proper maintenance is required for that to be able, for our landscapes to continue to function as they're supposed to aesthetically. Okay? Landscape maintenance can be costly and or time consuming. Here's a picture of some folks I used to work with that were out, basically doing some work pre-winter and getting ready, some pruning and things like that. But it was honestly, what we call landscape management or landscape maintenance portion of our business at the time was definitely a revenue generator. At the time, per person per hour, we were billing and this was 10 years ago, billing in the $35 to $40 per hour range. And that really adds up, and so being mindful of the fact that, what you are doing yourselves today may be costly for you to have to pay somebody else to do later. Right? Also, our skills decrease as we age and our limitations increase. So we have both a dropping of skills and an increase of limitations. And, at some point it may be, we have to start listening to our knees when they pop, when we bend down to pull the weed, and maybe listen to our back a little bit when it's aching, when we get done remulching our garden beds. And so and I don't know, I'm sure some of you are in the same situation I am, but things not only hurt more frequently, but they tend to hurt for a longer period of time. And so when we take that into account, I recently actually just came off of a summer renovation of the landscape around my personal home. And I'm not afraid to admit that what we have to do later with this landscape was a major factor in a lot of the decisions made for the design. Okay, so basically what we have to do is balance, right? We have to find balance between the benefit of what we are planning for ourselves, how we are planning our garden, the enjoyment we want to receive. That all falls in the benefit. And the cost, we're not just necessarily looking for monetary value, although that is a large part of it, the maintenance expense, but also the amount of time that we have to invest, the amount of wear and tear on our bodies that we have to invest going forward with our landscape. And we want to make sure that we always keep, as you see here, the benefit outweighing the cost. We want to try to design, to implement, and to maintain a landscape that provides us more joy than it does worry. Okay, and that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, to be honest with you, regardless of the age of my clients, I always design with maintenance in mind, and keeping maintenance down, primarily for these reasons. Number one request, bar none, for my clients is low maintenance. So I shoot for client satisfaction. Okay, and they're clever, by the way. They don't always come right out there, although they do. Don't get me wrong. They'll come right out and say, I want a low maintenance design. Okay. Sometimes I get people that say, I want a no maintenance or zero maintenance design. I haven't been able to figure out how to do that one yet. But they also say things I've heard, I don't want to be married to my landscape. I've had a gentleman tell me they worked really hard at their job so they could hire me to do my job, so there was that. I've also heard I kill silk plants. That was a good one. And I've also heard I have, instead of a green thumb, they have 10 brown fingers, so I've heard all kinds of things. But the fact of the matter is most of my clients are not master gardeners. Most of my clients are folks that actually want to enjoy the benefits of their landscape without putting a whole lot of input, both financial and time, into the maintenance of their landscape. So that, as a design build landscape designer, actually put me on the right path early in thinking about who my clients were and what their expectations were. As far as their expectations are one thing, but their abilities are traditionally low. A lot of the clients that I worked for, I was actually oftentimes surprised at how little some folks actually know about plants and plant care. And don't get me wrong, every profession has that, right? I'm sure my mechanic has a hard time understanding why, I know so little about my vehicle, or my doctor can't understand why I know so little bit about my own personal health, things like that. But it's still, I'm not kidding. We would have calls. I had a call one time where a young lady that we had done a landscape installation for early in the spring, and they were thrilled with it. She called me back in about this time of year, actually. It was about the end of October. And she was heavily concerned that we needed to replace their maple trees because the leaves suddenly turned orange and then brown and then fell off. And she was certain that the tree was dead. And to this day, I actually thought she was kidding at first, but I had to explain the concept of autumn to this young lady, that they were going to do that actually every year this time of year. But it still amazes me how little some folks know. And you have to actually take that into your thought process when designing for clients that they didn't grow up in a garden. A lot of my clients are very urban and didn't wrap their head around the work and the effects of the garden. Okay? Professional maintenance is not inexpensive. This has always been something that I've wrestled with, even at a time when I was in the industry and we appreciated revenue. I still sometimes felt guilty sending out invoices for the amount of money that you send them out, even though they were justified and all the work that, we were billing for was definitely, worthy of the bill. I grew up on a farm, and I grew up on a farm with folks that just, we did everything. If we could do it ourselves, we didn't pay anybody to do anything. And so I always felt bad charging people for works, in the garden. And I transferred that over into the designs that I was doing, in that I didn't want to propose a landscape for folks that was going to burden them in the future, or at least, minimize that burden as much as possible, right? And some of it's selfish. The longevity of the appearance of the landscapes that I design depends on quality maintenance. I want the project that I do today to actually help sell another client on having me do their work in the future. Okay? I would use current projects to get new projects. And if I sent a potential client by a former client's project that was poorly maintained or badly in need of maintenance, it didn't look good upon, didn't make me look good. Even if the burden fell upon the client to maintain the property and they weren't doing so, the fact is I designed a landscape that was, not easily maintained, and I didn't want to show that to people. And then finally, I am a landscape designer. I grew up in the garden, and I absolutely love gardening. But I love gardening because I want to. I absolutely hate gardening because I have to. The I have to tasks that come with gardening drive me nuts. If I have to prune a plant that really shouldn't have been planted in that spot to begin with, it drives me nuts. If I have to make a tree shorter because I didn't pay attention to the overhead environment, I don't like it. If I have to remove a plant that has overgrown a sidewalk, I don't like it. And so to me, it's a reminder of where I failed. So projects, the I have to's, when it comes to maintenance, I try to minimize. The want to's, all I can handle. Give me all the want to's. I actually enjoy remulching or adding mulch to the garden because I think it gives it a fresh, clean look, and I know that I'm benefiting the plants for the most part. I don't like unnecessary maintenance. Okay. All right. So what is high maintenance? Let's define it here, right? I like this lady here. She is not high maintenance. She's precious cargo with lavish instructions for upkeep. And I like that. It's a good positive twist on being called high maintenance. But actually, something that is high maintenance is any system that requires a high degree of work to ensure proper appearance and function. And that is, landscape in a nutshell, right? We want the proper appearance and function of our landscape. And if it requires a lot of attention to do so, we have a high maintenance landscape, right? So the other thing that we're dealing with when it comes to our landscape, quote unquote, system is that we are working with a living medium. All right, we are painting with plants. We are creating an environment out of living things. And everything that is alive requires upkeep, requires something to keep it alive. It requires nutrition, absolutely requires nutrition for it to grow. I've found one thing to be true about all living things is some other living thing wants to eat them. So pest control is a necessary act of maintenance in the landscape. Weed control, I still think it's funny, we spend a lot of time and energy creating a planting environment, creating planting beds rich in nutrients and organic matter and a wonderful place for a plant to live, and yet we're shocked that a weed would want to grow there. Weeds don't know they're weeds. They're just growing in this really nice bed you prepared. All living things require water, so irrigation comes into play. Pruning, I like to keep it low, but the fact of the matter is sometimes we have to remove part of the plants that we've installed. Mowing, trimming, and edging. I am admittedly not a turf fan overall. Trust me, I love the way a good lawn looks. I'm not a fan of maintaining turf. And the mowing, the trimming, the edging, those to me are the part of the have-tos that I talked about earlier. And then transplanting and replanting. I don't mind doing that as long as I'm not doing it because I have to, right? So we'll look at all of those today and how we reduce these one at a time. And this is just, some of those same folks I showed you earlier performing their $35 to $40 an hour work, and getting out and about and pulling the weeds and maintaining the beds and making everything look the way we want it to look. Okay. So how do we reduce? How do we reduce maintenance? So let's start with nutritional concerns. Okay. Nutritional concerns, basically the feeding of our plants, right? One thing that I teach my students is we design for the eventual size of our plants. We design at mature size, so to speak. And although we may not have our finger on the exact on that, we do have a pretty good idea how big the plants will get. The plant tags tell us, although they might lie a little bit, okay, they will. Just add about 10% to the growth size and you're probably pretty close to what the plant tag says. But what we want to do is make sure that we don't put, quote unquote, too many hogs at the trough. We have a finite amount of nutrients in the soil in the areas that we prepared. And by overcrowding our planting beds, we are creating a need to refeed. So the more plants we have in a given area, the more food will be required to keep all of the plants looking good, being healthy, keeping them well fed. Also, I found that choosing plants that have lower nutritional needs, or what we call soil tolerant plants, will help, plants that are not picky, so to speak, about where they're planted. A lot of times, we have these conversations about why are our hydrangeas pink and not blue? Well, you have to amend the soil. You have to add the ammonium sulfate and increase decrease the pH to get the blue color. Or why is my pin oak turning yellow in the summer? Same thing. We have iron chlorosis in there. Or this plant requires the quote unquote perfect soil. So we have to constantly amend and add organic matter. Those are the type of plants that you might want to utilize fewer of. Maybe not necessarily eliminate, but utilize fewer of them. Okay. Also, utilize deep planting beds with adequate organic matter. As organic matter breaks down, it actually helps provide a lot of things that our plants need, even beyond nutritional needs. We're talking about soil structure needs and the way water moves in and out of the soil. And then I put mulch, ... and the question marks there for a reason. I know in recent years, mulch has come under fire. Mulching has come under fire a little bit as an expensive, time-consuming, have-to maintenance thing of the landscape. And I see that, I understand that, I can appreciate the amount of work that goes into remulching. However, a lot of the other maintenance elements, nutrition, irrigation, and even weed control, I think are lessened quite a bit by the existence of mulch on our planting beds. And while I'm all for reducing remulching, I'm also mindful of the fact that we need to be a little bit careful as to what kind of issues are we replacing that mulch with. Okay, so when we replace remulching with other type of ground covers, so to speak, what kind of issues are we creating for maintenance down the road? Place material and proper exposures. In the upper right, you see a picture of a hydrangea, Macrophylla hydrangea, big leaf hydrangea, planted in the full sun. Okay. And then in the just below that to the left, you see an upper lower pictures. All of the that's actually of an Oregon gray poly. If you look at the 5 samples above the line and the 5 samples below, you notice a difference there. So in the upper right, we have a hydrangea that really typically would perform better with afternoon shade, planted in the afternoon sun. And what I see there is ample amounts of wilting, okay? And what do? As soon as we see a plant wilt, we realize that we can get this hydrangea through this hot period if we add water, right? This plant needs water. So we put water to it. Well, in the process of putting water to the plant, we're also dissolving nutrients that are in the soil. And as that plant takes up those nutrients, it also loses those nutrients. It pulls them out of the ground. So watering a plant to keep it looking good in an environment where it shouldn't be is actually helping contribute to a reduced amount of nutrients in the ground. Now in the lower, what we have here is a plant that would like a little bit more sun, planted in the shade. And if you notice on the lower part of the picture, all of those leaves of the Mahonia are quite a bit elongated, okay? And that's in the shade. So when you have elongation of a plant material, you have excessive growth, and excessive growth then requires more nutrients. And so we use the term leggy. When you put a full sun plant in the shade, it has a tendency to get leggy, elongated. That extra growth actually requires extra nutrition. And so you have to compensate for that nutrient loss as well. And then unfortunately, although I love a good green lawn, I love the way a good green lawn sets off my landscape plantings. It's work. It's work to keep a good green lawn, especially in the middle of the United States, here in Missouri, Kansas. We're just not awesome for lawns. We're a little bit too cool in the winters for warm season grass, and a little too warm, in the summers for cool season grass. And so we go with the cool season grass, and then we attempt to water it and fertilize it to green all year long. And to keep on top of that and be the president of the Green Lawn Club, we have to stay on top of our lawns, providing adequate irrigation and nutrition multiple times a year. So we have in the fall, we have the winterizer fertilizer. And then in the early spring, we have the fertilizer plus weed control with the Holtz, in there. And then probably right before going into the summer, we're going to fertilize it again just to, make it nice and pretty green as we move on. And it's a lot of work to keep that lawn green. So by using lawns sparingly, you can reduce that a little bit. And then what about native plants, right? So native plants are touted, rightfully so, as being more adaptable to your area. And they obviously have learned to live in your environment. They have learned to live in your soils. And they do so, I say learned, they've adapted to live in your soils. And they can do so typically with what is already there. So it requires much less fertilization in there. The one thing I will caution on with the use of natives is we've run into this quite a bit commercially, the landscape industry, is that yes, this plant has adapted to do well in native soils. However, the native soil doesn't stay on the job site. So right before they built everything, they scraped all the native soil off and brought back about a third of it mixed with whatever site fill was somewhere else. And so remember that native plants also have horticultural needs. And so you're not going to hurt their feelings any if you add some organics and amendments to the soil that's that. Just keep in mind, yes, native plants do well in our native soils, provided that they have our native soils. And so native plants do require, horticultural care, especially upon installation. So that gets us through the nutrition. How about pest control? Pest control, and I want to be clear on here. I have taken the word pest and it's big, right? I've expanded pest to include everything from viruses up to armadillos, groundhogs, and deer. Okay, so these are all pests in the landscape. Okay, and so otherwise we'd probably have a 3-hour discussion just on viruses alone. One of the things that we want to start with is to implement landscapes that have been designed with resistant plant material. And this is just an example here. There are lists like you wouldn't believe. There are lists everywhere. If you got on your Google box, and you Google deer resistant plants for Kansas, or fungal resistant plants for Missouri, you will find list after list after list of plants that can be utilized in your environment, whatever that environment is, to be resistant to whatever your pest is. I found that you can kind of group some of these things together too, like mammals that eat plants. So usually plants that are deer resistant are also rabbit resistant, things like that. It says shrubs that deer don't eat on there. I love that in there. I would say shrubs that deer haven't eaten yet. So that's why we use resistant, not proof, in there. Also, utilize companion plants. This has been something that my grandma has done forever. But if you ever notice how you see like allium bulbs planted with roses, the allium is used to help make the deer stay away from the roses. Actually, also I'm using marigolds in the vegetable gardens. I always thought when I was a kid that grandma put the marigolds in the vegetable garden just to add a little bit of pretty to the garden. But the reality is that there's natural, basically insect repellent in marigolds. And so it kept a lot of the harmful insects out of the garden by putting the marigolds in there. I've also seen daffodils planted in conjunction with daylilies, where the deer can't stand the daffodil foliage, but they'll tear up, just flat destroy planting of daylilies. And so if they come up thinking they're eating daylilies and they get a little bit of that old daffodil foliage in there, they may get a bad taste in their mouth and then leave your lilies alone as well. So just utilizing companion plants can actually help in keeping some of your pest problems down. Also, you can utilize material that encourages natural enemies. I highly recommend if a plant exists that brings the mountain lion or cougar into your landscape to keep your deer down, there are probably less dangerous ways to do so. What I'm thinking about more honestly is keeping insects out of your garden. What I found is planting a garden that encourages birds also helps keep insect issues way down, especially things like your problems with larvae, and also just things like mosquitoes. Just helping keeping insects at bay in the garden. If you're planting a garden for bluebirds, you're also probably doing a whole lot to keep your insects down as well. Place material and proper exposures again. And this actually has to do more with biological resistance. It's kind of what I have found realistically is that just like you and I, when I was a kid, you'd hear, don't go outside without a hat, or don't go outside without a coat, you'll catch cold. Okay. Well, it really wasn't the cold that was outside that was making us sick. The cold air had nothing to do with us getting sick. What it did was lower our resistance to everything else that was out there. Okay. So by lowering our resistance, then we became vulnerable to the pathogens that were all around us. And the same thing happens with plants. A healthy plant growing in the proper spot will be better able to ward off any kind of invasion. And this is from insects, or like what you see in this picture here. This is a sun-scald maple that also now has borer issues. To be honest, without the sun scald, the tree would probably still have borer issues, but it would be a healthy tree that wasn't already fighting one ailment, that was able to better outgrow the damage of the borers. And so keeping plants in a proper exposure helps keep them healthy, keeps them happy, and helps keep them with the ability to ward off any kind of issues that comes from the pathogens. And that's another thing to talk about here. We talked about the word resistance versus proof or immune. So if a let's say, for instance, a crabapple is fungal resistant. That does not mean that that crabapple will not get fungus. What that means is that the fungus that attacks that crabapple is less likely to do harm, permanent harm, to the crabapple. Okay, so that's really what the resistance means. You know, a lot of us like to use. Here's a good example. The American sycamore is this large, beautiful white bark tree in the wintertime that has a tendency to suffer a little bit from fungal anthracnose in the early part of the year. We utilize the London plane tree, which is a cross between the American and the Oriental plane tree or sycamore, because it has resistance to the anthracnose. Doesn't mean the anthracnose doesn't attack it. It just means that the tree outgrows the anthracnose better than the American sycamore does. Okay? Again, reduce lawn areas. You know, if it's not the nutritional concerns of a lawn, it's everything else that attacks it. And I don't know how Kansas is, but Missouri, honestly, if it's a fungus in Missouri, our plants have it. We're just fungal prone. And you know, we've got dollar spot and brown patch and you name it. Not only that, if we can get through the fungus, then we have the grubs, you know, that are in there, and the grubs typically bring moles as well, which you see. So the fact is, just again, keeping a nice green lawn that is healthy requires quite a bit of investment in time and typically, unfortunately, chemicals to keep these at bay. So by reducing the amount of lawn that we have in the landscape, we are also then reducing the amount of maintenance required. Okay? Natives, again, here's the thing. Native plants, absolutely 100% agree with the fact that native plants are outstanding at being resistant to native pests. You know, a lot of Missouri native plants and white-tailed deer have been cohabitating for years and years and years, and they don't bother each other. A lot of native Missouri plants know what kind of fungal environment Missouri is. It's been that way for tens of thousands of years, and they're tough. They survive. However, native plants are not really good. They're not adapted to ward off non-native pests. You know, and here you see, you know, you name it, right? Dutch elm disease, right? Took out the American elm. We've had the emerald ash borer takes out the green and the white ash that's a native Missouri tree. River birch is native to Missouri, and the Japanese beetle that you see in that picture right there will just flat devour them. So natives are a good way to reduce issues with native pests, but native plants may still have issues with non-native pests. All right, what about weed control? All right, if you are in the anti-mulch crowd, you are going to hate this slide right here, okay? Because I am a mulch fan. You know, there's a big scoop of it right there ready to go on an early spring remulching job. Basically, I'm a big fan of organic mulch and what organic mulch does. But what it really does as far as weed control is create somewhat of an organic barrier between the weed seed and the mineral earth. Most seeds require that mineral earth contact to germinate and thrive. And by putting this layer of organic mulch around your plants, over your planting beds, over the bare soil, really helps to reduce weeding. Now, it requires supplemental remulching because it's an organic material. So organic material will decompose. Organic material like mulches actually also wash away or blow away. And so we have this decreasing level, right, of mulch. And typically the weeds let us know when that is. I'm not a big fan of remulching for color. I'm more of a fan of remulching for need. So, you know, if I still have 2 to 3 inches of coverage of mulch, I'm not going to remulch my landscape just to make it all chocolate brown again. But I do like putting on an adequate amount of mulch to help keep weeds down. Living ground covers, the plant community has become, the discussion of late for a replacement for mulch. So in other words, instead of mulch bed with plants, we have layers of plants. So we have a ground cover layer, and then an intermediate layer, and then the structural layer, and then the canopy layer. And basically what we're doing is creating a plant community, a plant environment that have multiple levels of plants. And this can be very effective as far as weed control is concerned. But be mindful that, like for instance, in this picture that you see here with the liriope ground cover, this will do a very good job of keeping, because of competition, if nothing else, keeping weeds out. However, the weeds that do manage to fight through that competition are now harder to control. There is no chemical control at that point, which is fine with me anyway. There is no chemical control. So you're not going to go into that bed of ground cover and start spreading Roundup or spraying Roundup everywhere, because you don't want to actually kill the ground cover. And so you have to then resort to physical methods for weed control. I laugh and call, we're in the digital age, right? So we do have digital weed control. And we use these digits, right? And my fingers, and we get down in there and we pull it out. So there is some of that, that we have to be mindful of. So weed control, for the weeds that do make it through the plant communities and the ground covers, that weed control can be then more difficult in an established area or an established plant community. Okay. Hey, there's mulch again. I'm bringing up mulch. And we'll talk about mulch again later too with, irrigation control, but the nutritional benefits and the moisture benefits and then the weed control benefits, I think are pretty good. Now, what about weed control fabrics, right? I'm not a fan. I'm really not a fan of weed control fabric. But I actually grew up in an era where weed control fabric was black plastic that we rolled out around our plants and put rock over or whatever. The reality is the weed control fabrics are a huge step up from that. One of the big issues with the old plastics was we didn't know what, and there was not enough, air transfer, oxygen transfer. We kind of created an environment that was anaerobic. Also, you created an environment where water could not penetrate. Well, the weed control fabrics are the woven nylon weed control fabrics are helpful in that they allow some movement of oxygen, they allow some movement of water, but it is still greatly reduced. And unfortunately, if we want any kind of weed control at all underneath inorganic mulches, and I'm talking typically here, we're talking gravel or rock. However, shredded tires that look like mulch, that is also inorganic. Any inorganic mulch will need a weed control fabric underneath it because it just does not do a good job of preventing weed seeds from getting to that mineral earth otherwise. But if I'm using organic mulch, I am not using weed control fabric. Another reason for that too is plant health. If anybody's ever noticed, I've done a lot of renovations over the years. And it's a pain in the neck to renovate the ones with weed control fabric for multiple reasons. But one of the things I noticed a lot was the very shallow root depth of plants with weed control fabrics. What happens over time is that mulch actually decomposes on top of the fabric, and the plants start rooting into that layer, and then they lose that root layer below the fabric. I pulled out about an 8-foot tall dwarf Alberta spruce with my bare hands because all of its roots were on top of the weed control fabric one time. So just be mindful of the weed control fabric, and it's overall not plant friendly as far as weed control is concerned. Now, how do we reduce irrigation? Well, xeriscaping, right? Xeriscaping, and that's X-E-R-I. For a long time, I had students, the reason I clarified that is I had students turning in papers about xeriscaping, Z-E-R-O, but it's xeriscaping with an X. This is basically just water management and putting, plants together that like the same water needs. Or here again, we're talking about not overcrowding beds. Remember, I talked about the hogs at the trough, right? Well, the more hogs you have at that trough drinking the water, the more often you're going to have to refill that trough, right? So it's the same thing with more plants in the bed. Same thing happens. Also, utilizing drought-resistant material, plants that are okay with drying out in between rains. It's a fantastic way to keep your irrigation levels down a little bit. And then grouping plants with like water needs together, or in other words, hydrozoning. It's crazy, some plant combinations you can see. Here we have a full sun planting and then a more shade tolerant planting. And the plants in these environments enjoy similar water needs. And I have seen people kill junipers trying to keep hydrangeas alive. They'll drown one trying to keep another one alive. You want to make sure that, I'm not saying don't use hydrangeas, but if we're going to use hydrangeas, use them in an area surrounded by plants that have similar water needs. Okay, utilize proper exposures. Again, here's a situation where we have a hosta out in full sun. It's starting to show the effects of that in the afternoon, and our gut reaction is to water it through this, and that's going to create a situation where we're using a lot more water, possibly causing more damage to surrounding plants. Okay? And then, yes, again, reducing lawn areas. Again, I like lawns. I do. I just don't like the amount of care that's involved, the water that's involved, the fertilization that's involved, the chemicals that are involved in keeping lawns looking green and everything. Now, my lawn is actually not irrigated. Okay? It's not irrigated at all. And it is primarily cool season grass, which means what? Okay, it means that it's brown or very brownish, I should say, in late July, early August for sure. But what we have to understand also is that's not dead lawn, that is dormant lawn. And typically, as soon as it starts to cool off a little bit and we start getting more rains again, it greens right back up. Yeah, and to be honest, I don't mind not mowing it in August and July, or mowing it less frequently. Let's put it that way. So there's that. Organic mulch beds, again, helping, it keeps that surface evaporation down. It allows water that's in the soil to stay in the soil longer until it's utilized by the plants. And so, no, I have no issues at all with using good organic mulch to help keep your watering down. And then, oh my goodness, let's talk about irrigation cycles here for a second. Just because we have an automatic controller on our irrigation system doesn't mean we should just set it and walk away. What we want to try to do with basically with our overall irrigation is to water less often for a longer duration. All right. It promotes deeper rooted plants. It produces a little bit of more self-sufficiency in plants. And another thing is we don't need to water if it's wet. One of the things that truly irritates me is driving through town in a rainstorm and look over to the right and see an irrigation system just shooting water out in with the rain. It's frustrating. There's no reason to be putting that much water on the landscape. Another thing, I don't have an irrigation system now for either my planted beds or my turf. When I was in my previous residence, I did have an irrigation system for the turf, but I did not for the landscape beds. And even for the turf, I basically kept the controller button off of auto, and I kept it on off. And if we got dry, I went out and turned it on. And so watering by need, but not by a clock, is how I would suggest utilizing an irrigation system. And by watering for a longer period of time, that water penetrates more deeply into the soil, and then the plants can actually develop deeper roots and then become more self-sufficient and require less water overall. I planted I just replaced a good portion of my landscape, but the original landscape that I had installed, actually was done so about 17 years ago. And so in that initial installation, of course, that first year watered it just to keep it in, used hoses and went out and watered everything to keep it alive and doing well. From that point, after it was established, I did not add any supplemental irrigation to my landscape plantings, or my lawn actually, until this year, 17 years later, when I put in a new landscape. And I learned some things along the way. Because in 2012, we had a horrible drought. In 2012, absolute horrendous drought. It rained the entire month of April, and then it completely stopped raining. When I say completely, it did not rain a drop again until early September. And we were not out of the drought stage until sometime in mid-October. And so honestly, it was a little bit of a test. There were some plants in the landscape that I wasn't, I'm like, if they die, they die. I'll take them out and we'll redo it. And I lost 3 plants that summer, and they were dappled willow. The 3 dappled willow died. Nothing else in my landscape died. The river birch did not die. The Virginia sweetspire did not die. Of course, the junipers didn't die. Dwarf Korean lilac, you name it. None of my plants died because they didn't have a supplemental irrigation system that watered every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 7 o'clock in the morning, whether they needed it or not. They got by on what nature provided all the way through. Now, those dappled willow, I pulled them out and drug them to a ditch where one of them actually found life again. So I have a dappled willow growing in that ditch on my property. So it didn't actually kill it either. It probably just went into a little bit deeper dormancy. To be honest, probably me pulling them out of the ground is what killed them. So the fact is, plants have got along well without us for years and years and years and years and years. Okay. And so they're pretty self-sufficient if we let them be. Okay. How do we reduce pruning? All right. Pruning, kind of a pet peeve. First of all, if you're going to do it, make sure you do it right. I teach an entire course on that here in the spring, but design, plan with proper spacing, okay? Understand how large each of the plants that you are purchasing and installing will get, okay? Now, we talked a little bit earlier about how I said some plant tags lie. There is a true tendency for plant tags to, quote unquote, underestimate the size potential of their plants. And that is honestly by design. It's for marketing reasons. As we get more populated, if you notice, our properties are shrinking a little bit. Our subdivisions have, a third of an acre lot rather than 3 acre lots, things like that. And so we have less room. And so we want to do more with that. So we want to do more with less. And so plant breeders have figured out that smaller plants are more popular than larger plants. Plus, people think maybe smaller plant, I have to prune it less, I have to maintain it less, things like that. And so, case in point, I got burned by the plant tags when the knockout rose first came out because it was, tagged as saying a 3 foot by 3 foot mounding rose. And that would have been awesome, except that it was actually, I planted it for that spacing, and it turned out to be a 6 foot by 6 foot, and then grew 3 feet a month, something like that. But the fact is, they will cheat a little bit on the downside to make the plant a little bit more appealing to today's buyers, right? So when we're designing, if you notice, we create symbols to represent our plants. And so what I stress for my students now is to make sure that that symbol that I'm putting on the paper is to scale somewhere in that average size of what that plant gets. If I'm putting in a crimson pygmy barberry, then I'm drawing circles that are 3 to 4 foot in diameter. If I'm putting in a Mauritii viburnum, then my circle should be double that to a 6 by 8 foot. So I know how large that plant is going to get. And then it allows me to do one of two things. It allows me to either choose a different plant in an area where I don't have enough room, or it allows me to know what I'm getting into down the road, or what I'm doing to my clients, or what my clients have done to themselves. You know, if you go to the garden center and you find this really cute little burning bush, and it says compact on the cultivar's compactor, right? So it says compact. And then I come back and I plant it between my sidewalk and the foundation, and I have a 3-foot bed there. Then what am I doing with that plant when it gets to be 6 foot? You know, so we do this stuff to ourselves. Don't overcrowd the beds. Don't put too many plants. You know, I see a lot of landscape companies that actually do this, and we feel like if there's an empty spot in the bed, we need to fill it up upon installation. And some of that comes from, you know, the desire to make we want our clients to come home after we're done planting everything and go, oh, that's just lovely. We don't want them to come home and go, that's it. You know, we don't want people sometimes don't have the patience to wait for growth. And so one of the things, it's the onus is on us to, as designers, or to explain that it's going to be a little less full upon installation, but within 3 years, that's full, it's looking good. You have, you know, rather than 5 years from now, you're ripping things out. 5 years from now, you're bringing people over to show it off. And don't get me wrong, I want it to look good upon installation too. So we use, you know, larger size plants upon installation, which helps with that a little bit. But in general, we need to have knowledge of what the plant's potential is before we decide where to put it. And we talk about, I have a discussion about plunking. It's a term that I use for that impulse landscape buy, where we go to the garden center and there's an absolutely beautiful plant there, and we want it, and we're going to buy it, and we're going to put it somewhere. We have one open spot left in our landscape, so this plant will be perfect for that open spot, without really knowing whether it's perfect or not. You know, we buy it, we go home, we plant it, and then in 3 years, we're trying to figure out what to do with it. And that's what I want to try to avoid. So do some planning and take into account the mature size, because this happens to a lot of people. Those plants started off as cute, tiny little balls when they were purchased at the garden center, and they grew up to eat the front porch. Okay, and honestly, as you can tell, keeping them at that shape and size is a job in and of itself. And realistically, they probably need, unless they're really into sitting on the front porch and not seeing anything, they probably really need to prune it one more time at the base and kind of start all over. Okay, we want to keep the height of the material in mind as well. You know, that's one thing that a two-dimensional overhead landscape design does not do for us, right? We get the diameter right, so we made sure that we have enough room for this plant to grow around and get wide. But we have to also be mindful of what this plant does as far as height goes. And you know, this is a pretty dramatic example you see right here, but I see it way too often, where we have that corner evergreen that is now either at or above the eaves, and it actually goes beyond the care and performance of the plant. And we're actually in some cases starting to talk about the structure, you know, and some issues that we might have even with the maintenance and the vitality of your home. You know, if we start getting plants in our gutters and in our downspouts, and we start knocking things off that need to be there because the plants are planted too close or they got too tall, then we're causing issues beyond plant care and into actual structure, health of the house, right? Also, we want to plant in proper exposures. Again, we talked about a plant that is in, for instance, a full sun plant that is planted in the shade has a tendency to get leggy. But one of the things that we do is we cut that meristematic tip back and promote bushiness, right? So we find ourselves doing a lot of that if the plant's not in the right exposure. And so that can be a little bit of an issue as well. The other thing we'll find is sometimes, you know, cutting off sunburnt, you know, a plant that should be in the shade, but it's in the full sun and it gets kind of those crispy branches and things like that, cutting those off as well, right? Organic mulch, right? To be honest, I'm just kidding. I really couldn't find any way at all that mulch helps reduce pruning. Nope, can't think of it. So I tried, but we're gonna have to leave mulch off of how to reduce the pruning as we go forward. Also, mowing, right? How about mowing? All right. For one, design for larger beds, reducing lawn areas. There's actually, what's interesting about this is I've had this conversation many times, many times. And typically what we run into is a lot of folks don't recognize or don't at least put the mowing maintenance on the same level as landscape maintenance. I asked a question one time to a client that we were having this discussion with. I said, would you rather mow, fertilize, trim, water, but mow that space once a week or mulch it once a year? That's the part I don't, for some reason, I've found that in some folks' mind, a weekly mowing is not as maintenance intense as an annual remulch. And I haven't wrapped my head around that one yet, because I fully understand that. And I think part of it, a lot of it is a lot of folks actually hire mowing done. And so they don't see that as personal maintenance, but keep in mind, you're paying somebody to mow that lawn area once a week as well. So that now, beyond just the maintenance reduction, we actually have in design a principle called proportion. And proportion basically, it has to do with the size relationship of elements in the landscape, but it also has to do with, realistically, it has to do a lot with spatial relationship as well. And we have mass and void, we have empty and full. And we really want to try to create an equal amount of mass to void in the landscape. So that means we should have the same amount of open space, low open space, as we do mass or planted or structural space. So things that fall into mass would be the residence, the structure itself, trees, shrub, bushes, those vertical elements. Voids are things like driveways, sidewalks, lawns, ground cover areas, low areas like that. So we can develop areas that have an adequate amount of void without using lawns. So we can use ground covers, we can use mulches, we can use hardscape spaces, things like that. So we can all but eliminate lawns in the landscape and still have an adequate amount of void to help balance out the mess that's there. Also, I like the term swoopy. I don't know that it's a technical term, but I like big, large, swoopy, curved bed lines that are easy to mow around, to make mowing quicker, easier. Also, I'm a big fan of not weed eating. And so I like to put a mower deck on the edge of a bed and blow it out away from the bed, all the grass clippings, and just mow around there. I don't like to do 3-point turns. I'm a big fan of just getting and going on there, which also means I'm not a huge fan of the hardscape bed edge. And that could be, what we see here, the stones placed around the outside, kind of like a string of pearls, I guess, around the outside of the bed. I've also seen brick and pavers, I should say, pavers and brick used as an edge. I don't have an overall aesthetic issue with it, but I do have a little bit of a maintenance issue with that. It basically mandates that I'm going to have to trim tall grass around the complete perimeter of every single landscape bed that I've designed. And I'm not a fan of that. I don't think it's necessary. Also, I think I'm not a big fan of making the edge of the bed, that area that defines the space, a highlighted feature, if that makes sense. So in some situations, it's actually a very nice touch. It's a good aesthetic touch. But I think when I'm weighing, that cost benefit, I prefer to not have that hardscape edge and have more of the V-trench type of an edge on there, mulch lip we call it. Also, you can consider different turf varieties. Especially in Kansas areas, this works really well, is to have like a low prairie look. Buffalo grass got to be a big thing back in the 90s. We tried it here in Missouri, and unfortunately, we're a little too humid for it here. So a little bit more of a high prairie type area. This worked really well. Another reason it didn't work well for some of my clients is it was a matter of a misconception. They had heard about this wonderful buffalo grass that they only have to mow once a season. The unfortunate thing is they thought they would mow it once with that really cool dark green, light green stripe, and it would keep that nice, crisp, fresh mowed, manicured look all season. And that's not actually the case. What you get is what you see here, and that is a nice wavy, looks like your grass needs to be cut look. And so that was actually part of the decline in popularity as well, was the overall effect after. And then you can also, like I talked about earlier, replace turf with another living ground cover. Here's a Rhyope spicata. That's non-native, but we could also utilize many different sedges and low grasses, things along those lines. You can go even more exotic with the pachysandras and things like that. But you have the ability to create that low green void in the landscape without using turf grass, should you desire. Additionally, we can bring the natives back, right? So we can bring the natives back here. I love this picture, by the way. To me, this looks like home, but you have a medium grass prairie with forbs thrown in there. It can be as complicated as actually getting rid of everything that you already have in this area and planting seed mixes with native grasses and native forbs and sedges. Or you can basically just stop mowing and see what happens. Also, or mow once a year. A lot of these have some different maintenance concerns. You might have a once a year burning or once a year mowing. You might also have some issues with invasive woody material coming in, maybe the calorie pear seedlings or honeysuckle or eastern red cedar, which is native but still an issue. But so there are new concerns, but typically less of a concern if we just increase our native / naturalized areas. So it's basically embracing a different look that requires less frequent maintenance. Transplanting and replanting material, okay? Reducing seasonal color areas helps a lot. And what I mean by seasonal color areas, of course, is typically we refer to those as annual planting areas, like what we see here. So by reducing the amount of annual plants that we utilize, or even quote unquote tender perennials, so those are plants that would be perennial if we didn't plant them here. The plants that need to be removed and or replanted each spring is something to use less of, or use them more as an accent. I am a big fan of using seasonal color. I'm not a big fan of using seasonal color in the actual landscape planted beds. Annuals, in a nutshell, are trying to complete their entire life cycle in one season. To do so, it requires a lot of moisture, requires a lot of nutrients, things like that. Usually requires soil amending. And so by maintaining or confining this maintenance to a finite area like container gardens, great way to go. You have the ability to completely control your soil, your nutrition, and your water. And you can have this wonderful pop of color that helps gets us through some of those sleepy months, in the summer and maybe even the fall, without the extra work that goes into preparing a bed for such. You also need to be mindful that just using herbaceous perennials as opposed to annuals does not mean you are drastically reducing maintenance. A lot of herbaceous perennials have considerable needs as far as transplanting and replanting. Usually herbaceous perennials that are doing well have a tendency to grow in a lot of places. And sometimes they're growing to places that we're not really all that a fan of, right? So what we find ourselves doing is we plant this cute little, well, let's say we plant this, let's go with, what's a good spread? We could go with our little blue stem, great native grass, right? So we put it in, it's doing awesome. In fact, it's doing so awesome that it's now completely overtaken our bed and moving out into the lawn. Well, we can control that with a mower. But it starts moving into other parts of the landscape. And now we're digging it up and we're bringing it to master gardener meetings and we're trying to pawn it off on somebody else. So the thing is to be mindful of, just because it's even natives, right? Even natives have a tendency to grow like crazy sometimes. And so you can have an invasive issue or even a out of control spreading issue with any plant. And so just by switching from annuals to perennials does not mean you're eliminating the need to transplant or replant. Okay? So limit the use of spreading materials in general. This is actually a picture of Itea, a Virginia sweet spire. This is a wonderful plant. I love the spring bloom. I love the fall color of this plant. I love the fact that it colors up well, even in partial shade. One of the downsides to this plant, however, is it has a tendency to colonize, which means it's going to send out root runners everywhere and new plants are going to pop up. And as long as you're aware of this and understand it, you can actually use this to your benefit. This is a great bank stabilizing plant. But if you're wanting to keep your Iteas as neat little pockets of plants throughout the bed, it's probably not going to happen without a lot of work. You're going to be constantly maintaining the extra plants that come along with it. Okay. Now, beyond just reducing our actual individual maintenance work, we also need to understand that our style of landscaping, our style of garden, affects the amount of maintenance that is required as well. So, we're looking at informal styles versus more formal styles. And so in the informal category, I've included, your contemporary type plantings, your cottage type plantings, your naturalized type plantings. Informal, we're talking more classical type stuff, so basically with the informal, I'm looking at designing like Mother Nature, designing loose, okay, designing without neat rows or neat patterns of plants. It's basically just allowing one plant to grow into the next and creating masses. Formal is a little bit more exact. Whether we're doing an Asian garden or a French formal garden or Victorian, there are rules that we have to follow. And so when the plants start breaking those rules, it requires a little bit more maintenance to stay on top of it, right? Okay. So then, would you rather maintain the upper left or the lower right? The fact of the matter is, they're both not easy to maintain. But the one on the upper left, when maintenance needs to be done, you're going to know it a lot faster and you're going to have to get onto it right now. Okay. Now the lower right, if a weed comes up in there, we might even just leave it to see what it does because it's going to blend. It's loose. It's fine. Let it stay in there. Nobody's even really going to notice for a while. Upper left, you're going to notice. You're going to notice. Lower right, if a plant decides doesn't want to live there anymore, isn't doing well, decides to wither, you can actually leave it in there. But if you lose a plant in the middle of that really cool lattice work going on the upper left, you're going to know it. And that's going to have to be taken out and replaced immediately. And so it's really a frequency issue more so than lessening maintenance. You still have to do maintenance, and actually it may even be harder to maintain the one on the right when you actually have to do it. But the point is you have to do it less often, and that helps a little bit as well. Water features. Love the water features. I absolutely love water features for what they can do in the landscape, but they are typically a higher maintenance. They are. But they might be high enough in benefit to kind of keep it here. I love the tactile effect, the cooling effect, the sound. I love all of that a water feature provides. But the reality is it does come with some issues. that have to be addressed. For one, maintaining your water level. In general, that means make sure it doesn't leak, right? Leaks are a big issue when it comes to self-contained water systems like you see in these pictures. Also, just splashing and evaporation can be an issue. And when you lose enough water, then you can cause issues with your mechanical pumps. When the water level drops to a point that you're sucking air, so to speak, you can actually burn up very expensive pumps. I've also found over the years that people are not a fan of green water in their landscape water features. Algae is an enemy. And so there are all kinds of ways to try to create a perfect environment, a good mix of bacteria and plant material and fish and frogs and all this. And then you can just give up and dump a bunch of algicide in it and call it good. But the reality is that you're creating an environment that is very conducive for algae growth, yet we don't like it. So you have to be on that. We also have winter concerns. Specifically, do we run it? Do we let it, do we turn it off? You can actually, most water features, you can actually let run all winter long, but it creates some issues. You can have what we call ice lock. So a lot of the water that's supposed to be going, through the pump is actually frozen on the rocks and around. There was actually a legitimate issue. The picture you see on the right there of the three, on the far right, you notice that set of stone steps that comes down to a bridge over that. This was a water feature that actually we started and let it run over the winter. However, the splash from that water feature was freezing on those stone steps. And so that created a hazardous environment for folks trying to walk up and down those steps. Luckily, it was in the backyard, so it was the homeowners themselves, but they also didn't want to fall, and so it was deemed better to let the feature go until summer on that. And then fish, do you have fish? If you have, if you add another living element to your water feature, then you are adding another element of maintenance. So you have to feed the fish. You have to make sure that the fish have enough overwintering room if you're going to leave them out there. If you're talking koi, you're talking a little bit more finicky. Goldfish typically can handle almost anything, but if you're putting koi in there, you have to have adequate depth or find a place to overwinter them during the winter months. And then you can actually, do you have a reservoir above ground or below ground reservoir for your system? Both the right and the left there, you see those are water features that have a pond that they pull water from. The one up in the middle, actually, the water disappears into a bed of rock and the reservoir is actually below. Those pond-less systems are actually considerably less maintenance than the ones with the pond, but are still not, quote unquote, maintenance free on that. And then, filter, you have to keep on top of your filters for this, make sure they don't become clogged. Make sure your filters are doing a good job of keeping debris and things out of the pump, all that kind of stuff. So basically, it's a feature that requires some work, or they are features that require some work, and you just have to decide if the amount of work that's being required is still staying on underneath the amount of benefit that you're receiving from the water feature itself. So another thing that I try to avoid in my personal landscape and then subsequently in the designs I do for others are what I call the extra effort plants. Okay. So these are plants, these are plants that are marginally hardy to start with. Let's start there. So we have the US, hardiness zones, and you can see, look at the map there, see where you are. Typically I talk to folks that are in the 5-6 area. So if we're putting in a plant that is 6 at the lowest and we're in a 5-ish area, we are saying we're going to get this plant through it. Okay? That if we have one of those really cold winters, this plant is going to suffer, but we're going to do we're going to run out with a bed sheet. And when we have a frost warning, and we're going to put a bed sheet over it, we're going to pile it up, cover it up with mulch, just to get it through the winter. If instead of doing that, we stick to a plant palette that is in our proper hardiness zone, then we don't have to do that. We don't have to run out with a bed sheet when it starts to get cold. You know, we had our first, freeze warning here in central Missouri this week. And it's a news story every year. What do you need to do with your plants? And how do I protect my plant from frost and yada, yada. Bring all your indoor plants indoors, obviously. But how do I protect the outdoor plants? And my answer typically is a little bit callous, I think, and that is, not plants that can't handle the frost outside anyway, right? Next up, what about plants that require extra support? The plants in a cage, I like to call them. I'm a big fan of peonies, but if they're going to flop, I'm going to let them flop. I'm not a big fan of putting cages around plants so that they can stand upright. Hydrangea is the same thing. I'm a big fan of the smooth hydrangea. It's a native Missouri hydrangea. I don't mind using the cultivar Annabelle because it does a better job of holding its heads up when it's in bloom than grandiflora does. And so if I'm aware of what the plants do, then I will pick plants that do something else, or I let them do it. If my peonies are looking awesome and they get this super big, gigantic flower head on it and they lay over, then we're going to let those flowers lay over. Just because the way I look at it is these plants, that's the way they grow. And if I don't want a plant that grows that way, I will choose a different plant rather than putting supports around them, things like that. That's me personally. And we're talking about reducing maintenance and maintenance needs. Plants that require extra protection. Here we have a person putting a fence up around their tree. I'm not advocating that you don't do this, especially if you are in a deer-prone area. However, keep in mind that it is extra work to have to do that. If I have to work harder to get a viable plant, I may want to choose a different plant. Plants that can't handle the great outdoors. I don't have any cannas in my landscape because I don't want to dig the cannas up in fall and put them in a cardboard box and store them in my basement until next spring and put them back out. Now, if I decide I want cannas in the landscape, I'm going to treat them as an annual. I'm going to plant them where I want cannas. And should they not survive the winter, then I will plant them again next year. But I will know what I've got in store for me. I choose not to put cannas in. I'm not a big fan of having to dig plants up and overwinter them just so that I can have them again next year. I will choose, a different plant on that. And then plants that need a beautician, right? Keep in mind, these shapes are really, really cool, but I have yet to see a plant that grows that way naturally. And so to keep this cute little arrangement of meatballs going requires almost a full-time gardener, actually. Likewise, I am super impressed with how this garden works and the visual effect of this garden. However, I do not want to volunteer to be the person in charge and responsible for making sure it stays this way. To be honest, I don't even know how they get to the lavender in between all the evergreen hedge work to even maintain that lavender. So you can count me out on maintaining it. I would love to go visit this garden and walk through it as long as somebody else is taking care of it, right? And that's how I feel about over-pruned topiaries and stuff like that. Although I do think that's funny and I wish I could do that. That would be a blast. But anyway, keep in mind, plants with a cool shape, plants that are twisted, spirals, look like soft serve ice cream, things like that. It requires constant work to keep it that way. I'm Irish. My heritage is Irish, right? I think a Celtic knot garden is just would be the pinnacle. Maybe when I retire, I'll do that. But then I should probably, when I start getting that, review and listen to myself right now and realize that I'm not going to keep my Celtic knot garden looking like a Celtic knot. I'll plant it, I'll make it look really cool, and then I'll let it go. And the fact is, I'm aware of that now. So I need to remind myself of that in the future. All in all, in a nutshell, we want to reduce the energy, okay? And I'm not just talking about environmental concerns. I'm talking about your personal physical energy investment, okay? Evaluate your current task and ask yourself, is this going to create extra work for me in the future? Okay, whatever that task is. If you are installing new plants, if you're prepping your garden, ask yourself, is this going to create extra work for me in the future? The fact is, the answer is yes. Okay, whatever we do in the landscape is going to create extra work for us in the future. But then we have to decide at that point, after realizing the answer is yes, do we foresee ourselves having ability to continue with that type of work in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years? Are we still going to be able to take care of it? Depending on where you are in that life cycle of a gardener, it should start affecting the decisions that you're making with your garden going forward, okay? So just be cognizant of where you are in that lifespan and how much time you think you've got left where you're going to enjoy doing what you enjoy doing now. I would highly encourage you to maximize the amount of joy that you get out of your garden right now, without a doubt. But understand, when it starts to become a task, when it starts to become a burden, then you start to get less joy out of it. It's time for a change, right? It's time to maybe rethink what you've already done and put more thought into what you're doing going forward, okay? Just remember, it's a process of weighing the benefits versus the costs and simplify accordingly, right? So we're gonna run through just a quick little exercise, right? Where we're going to start with, let's start with this image that you see on the screen right here. This is a house, and let's say this is a project that I'm working on for a couple that want to increase their outdoor living space. They have a little pad in the backyard coming out of one door, and then they have another pad a little bit south of that, a little larger, but not a large enough space to entertain in. And they want to have more entertainment space. They want to have less maintenance. They're having trouble with those existing trees that you see on there. They're having trouble with grass growing underneath those trees. So the first thing I do is I address the outdoor living space, and I create a patio that maximizes the depth of their yard, provides access from both doors, and then a nice living area there. And already by doing that, I've eliminated, you know, a considerable amount of mowing maintenance just in the development of that patio space there. And then from there, I define the areas that I want to be planted versus the areas that I want to be turf. And one of the things that I look into is, do I have about the same amount of mass as void, keeping in mind that I can fill these non-mowing areas with mass. And so I create a planting bed there. Now, what I want you to look at on this planting bed is notice the line, and notice you don't see a lot of what I call roller coaster going on. It's nice, big, swoopy curves, easy to mow, easy to maintain, and large planting areas. Probably just with that move alone, at least cut the amount of weekly mowing in half. Not only that, we've eliminated a good portion of the grass that was struggling to grow underneath the canopies of those existing trees. And then it's just a matter of, let's play with our plants and decide where we're going to put what. You know, we bring our mid-levels in that structural area, then we bring our smaller levels of shrubs in, and then finally, some of the spaces that are left, we create a cool little hatching pattern in there, then that can be ground cover, you know, so we still have a little bit of that void left in there, that low green carpet without the mowing. And that's just a matter of, you know, a lot of folks will say, well, how is that lower maintenance? You just doubled the planting space. I did. But for the most part, our planting spaces require a lot less maintenance than our lawn spaces. You know, like I said, I'm not mowing that space now once a week. I may be mulching that space once a year. So I've eliminated, and if I choose my plants well, and if I take into account the size that they're going to get, not where they are when we plant them, but the size that they are going to get, that I've ensured that I don't have to worry a lot about, pruning. If I choose my plants well for pest resistance and for low nutritional requirements, then I've actually done a good job of simplifying and lessening the amount of maintenance going forward. And a lot of times people, when I say simplify, everybody's like, well, I don't want a boring landscape, and I don't want a boring garden. Well, you can be simple, but not be boring. And to kind of end up our discussion today here, before we open it up for questions, I should say, we've got some images to show you of what I consider to be simple, but not boring landscapes. Nice, large, swooping curves with plants in mass that are very suited for taking care of themselves. Something along this right here, where we have the large grassy naturalized area with a finite amount of mowed space, to a really neat little bench in the background. Simple, but not boring. Okay. Also, something along this line, simple landscapes that are not boring. Large amounts of area that you don't have to mow, don't have to maintain, but to just let these plants exist and do what they're going to do. You're not pruning plants into funky shapes and things like that. You're just letting it be. And it's also about developing a mindset to let your plants be, to understand that, plants do fine without our input a lot of times. There's nothing aesthetically boring about a simple landscape. In fact, it can be quite inviting.